Yep, tonight's going to be a whistle-stop tour taking you from zero to Mobile Hero and Xamarin, hopefully in 45 minutes, but we'll see how we go. So this is Jim. Jim is your average geek with some background in programming who's heard about something called Xamarin and has decided that he wants to start making apps to show off to all his friends. But what is Xamarin exactly? So the traditional way of doing Xamarin is to use a C# backend, as you'll see here. So that is the idea of all your business logic is just shared across platform, whether that's iOS, Android, UWP, as you can see here. So all the business logic, C#, data access layers, models, things like that. But then you've got the UI themselves. So the UI, natively, you'd have to write it in the traditional sense. So that would be storyboards for iOS, XML or Android XML, whatever you want to call it, for Android, and then XAML for UWP. That's fine, but that means that you need to be able to know how to do these user interfaces on all three platforms, which can take time and effort and isn't always easy. So the more recent kid on the block that Xamarin came up with is something called Xamarin Forms. So what that gives you is the same shared C# backend that you might have known traditionally if you've ever done the Xamarin approach natively, but it means that you can also do shared UI code, as you can see up here. So that's one code base for your business logic, one code base for your UI. When it comes to actually compiling it and then sending it to the device, it looks the same across all the platforms, as you'll see shortly. So you don't need to worry about being able to tell when you run the app, it all looks the same. As I said, you've got two ways of doing it. That's either XAML, which isn't actually the same dialect XAML as you might know from Windows if you've ever done Windows Desktop. It's still XAML, but it's a slightly different dialect. They're working on changing that with something called XAML Standard, but at the moment they are slightly different. But both are quite intuitive, and you'll be able to pick them up. So Jim's decided that he knows about Xamarin, and he's heard that you can use this C# code that is just wrappers around the native APIs to produce these apps, one code base for all these different platforms. But how does he go about it? So he's got three options, and I can do maths. I'm aware there's two photos here. I'll explain why in a minute. The first one you may well recognize from anything you do already is Visual Studio for Windows, specifically Visual Studio 2017, but of course it is supported before then. So when you install Visual Studio, or even if you just load the installer to modify your installation, you'll have the option of doing what's called mobile workload for Visual Studio, which will give you everything that you need to get started with Xamarin, whether that's the Android emulators and things like that. The other option that you'll see on the right is Visual Studio for Mac. So this started life as Mono Develop, which some of you may or may not have heard of. It then became Xamarin Studio, and then post Microsoft actually buying Xamarin in 2016 because they saw the power of it, it became Visual Studio for Mac, and they added in stuff like the Roslyn compiler, which you may know, which makes life a lot easier and opens up all the possibilities of being able to develop more on Visual Studio than just mobile apps. Now, one thing to be aware of when you do apps on Visual Studio is that it will, if you create a new project, it will create projects for iOS, Android, and UWP by default. But iOS, due to Apple's license agreement, it does require Xcode build tools to compile it, which just basically means you need to have a Mac available, and whether it's over the network or whatever, that it can use to compile it. Which is fine. You don't need to go out and spend loads of money on a fancy MacBook or an iMac. A very recent 1 or 2, even 3-year-old Mac Mini will do. Stick it in a cupboard on the network, and you'll be able to see it over the network, hopefully, and then just deploy to it. The other thing as well that's great that Microsoft have done, which makes it a lot easier for you, is that you don't need to worry about having a screen connected, because if you need to accept an Apple license agreement or you need to install some components that are missing on your Mac, the window will just pop up on your Windows machine and go, hey, you need to agree to this, or you need to install it. Click OK, it will just do it for you without needing to actually go and use the Mac itself, which I think is pretty cool because it just makes life easy. The other one I forgot to mention. So I said there's 3 and I've only pictured 2. The other one is Rider from JetBrains, which you may or may not have used. It does do Xamarin, but I've never actually tried writing Xamarin in Rider, so I didn't want to include it on here because I've never used it to tell you much about it. So is anyone in here a musician or a pianist that can tell me what those notes are that are highlighted on that diagram? Anyone? C sharp and F sharp, yeah. So yeah, that's Jim at the bottom going, well, I know about Xamarin now, but okay, I've got these choices. What language do I pick? And that's great. And the reason that I've highlighted these two notes on the piano, other than the fact that I've started taking piano lessons again and got a bit obsessed with musical notes, is that, yeah, Xamarin does support both F sharp and C sharp. Both support the XAML and the code for your UI and whatever, and obviously, of course, C sharp or F sharp for the business logic. And that's great. C sharp, obviously, historically is the one that's been in Xamarin for the longest. But you can do like for like, F sharp, C sharp. Obviously, the language is different, the syntax. But anything you can do in C sharp, you can do in F sharp as well. However, some of it can be a bit awkward. So one of the great things that's going on at the moment in Microsoft is that Don Syme, the great benevolent dictator behind the F sharp language, is actually on secondment to the Xamarin team at Microsoft for 2 years to kind of nurture the marriage between F sharp and Xamarin Forms and Xamarin, which means that it's, he's started to develop a library called Elmish, which is based on the web framework Elmish, which itself is based off Fable. So what this Elmish is that he's created is a new Get package called Elmish for Xamarin Forms, which is great because it means that there's now a more, thanks to Don Syme, a more functional flavor to the Xamarin that you can write in F sharp, and we will see an example of it shortly. One thing to note, the Elmish for Xamarin Forms package is in preview. It's stable, but it is in preview, so by all means try it out. But if you've got any feedback, pull requests, anything like that, they are open to it and really want to make it as good as possible. Now, another thing to note about Elmish is that there's two kind of flavors of Elmish in the Elmish for Xamarin Forms package. You've got what's kind of called half Elmish and then full Elmish. The reason for that is because they're trying to make the step between C sharp and F sharp as easy as possible. So half Elmish is just some more object-oriented concepts in F sharp, so that if you're coming from a C sharp or OO background, it just makes life a little bit easier to pick up. And that's kind of what I've written, something in that you'll see shortly, because my functional is not great. So it just, I think it's great and makes it a lot easier to get started. So we can talk about it, so it's right. But let's have a look at demo. This is just a very simple example. So at the moment it's empty, but we're just going to do, as the name suggests, a counter, because Jim's learnt about Xamarin and understands how easy it can be now to do cross-platform for different devices, but he actually wants to make something. Nice, simple one to get started, a counter. So what we'll do, obviously you need a counter, so we'll have a label. So yeah, again, if you've ever done UWP, some of this will look quite similar. So we'll give it a name first of all, so we can refer to it. So we will call it counter label. Then we will give it text to start with of 0. Font size, so it's nice and big to see at the back. And then a text color. Does anyone want to pick a really bright color from this list? Purple, okay. Purple it is. So, yeah, so we've got the label, so that will show the number. There we go. And then we want to do, obviously, a button to make it go up. So, again, we'll give it a name. We will just call it click button. Give it some text. So, obviously, you want something written on it. So, we will just put, seems logical enough. And then you click it, we want to do increment counter. Clicked. Give it a font size. Don't worry about the squiggle, that's just because it's saying at the moment that it doesn't exist, so it doesn't know what this click handler is that it's looking for. So we'll give it a nice big font size again, and there we go. So simple as that. That's the UI. I'll show you it running in a minute when we've actually got it doing something, but a stack layout is, as you'd imagine, one thing on top of another, and it just builds up the stack. Label, button, and then one of the things you'll see is when you start a new project is that it will create the projects. Now, one thing you'll notice is that it hasn't created a UWP one because I created this project in VS for Mac. That's because if you want UWP, create it on a Windows machine, because there isn't such thing as a Windows build agent like there is a Mac build agent to build iOS. So you just get Android and iOS by default. But you'll get the shared project here, and then you'll get the platform-specific ones. So the bit that we care about, of course, is this file that we've just edited, and then what we call the code behind, which is the CS, which is where we will do the logic. So obviously we're doing a counter. So the first thing we want to start with is the counter, and then we want that handler that I wrote that it couldn't recognize. So we'll do that quickly. So that will be, I think that's what I called it. So we will just increase the count by 1 and then change the text. Obviously we do to string because obviously it's a label, it needs text. So one of the cool things that you can actually do, because we're ready to run it now and we want to see it, but you know, we want to prove that it's one code in 2 different places. So one of the cool things that you can actually do is if you right click and go to options, it will bring up this box. And if you just go to run configurations, you can add a new configuration that will actually tell it, deploy it to both at once. So you'll see what I mean about the fact that it's in one place, one code base to 2 devices. So we will tick both. So that will do it to iOS and Android at the same time. So let's just set that as our configuration. Click play and just make sure that it's going to go. Yeah, so that's going to go to the simulator that I've got running already to save some time. And again, that's the simulator as well. It's just a nice, quick and easy way to deploy it and see an output without having to wait for it to deploy to a phone, which can sometimes take a bit longer. So that's just building now, so we'll wait for that. So whichever one wins will pop up first, probably. So there you go. So as you'll see, it's actually running on both iOS and Android. So as well as the button that you saw, can do it on either, and it works on both. Awesome. So we'll just make a quick change to that so you can see how easy it is to make a change and how quick it is. So we will just stick it in the center. That one. Nope, that one. Yeah, there we go. So if we just stop that a minute, if my cursor comes back, where is it? Hey, I have lost my cursor apparently. Okay.
Change space and back again, sometimes makes it, or 4-finger swipe up and down or something like that.
Oh, there we go. Thanks.
PowerPoint has this whole annoying habit of
Okay. Yeah, so one of the things you might have noticed was that it was positioned a bit badly. So we will just quickly put it, so all vertical options does, it just says stick it in the middle. And then we'll tell this one to go in the center as well. So if we stop that, run that again, it should very quickly deploy. And you'll see what I mean. You know, it's quite a quick feedback loop, and it was pretty simple to make changes. There we go. It's just deploying it on both. Apparently iOS wins. Oh, okay, it's still in the wrong place, but again, still works. We didn't break it. Woo! So I just want to quickly show you, as you saw the buttons and the stuff that's going on. So in a minute, I'll show you the F# equivalent, and you'll see that the similarities between them, which is great when you want to pick it up, because it means that you can kind of use your C# experience to try the in F#. So yeah, what I wanted to show you is you saw that we've got the layout and the button. We've got the shared project with the page that's created by default, with the code behind, and then the platform-specific ones. So, said, we'll do F#. So this one here is the same counter, but in F# instead. So as you'll see, it uses XAML as well. So it's got a stack layout, a label, a button. Again, the button just says increment, font size of 72 and 46 on the button. So all very similar. But what about the bit that actually does all the work? So in here, actually, in the F# version, the one difference is you do it in the app .xaml.fs file, but the concepts are similar. So you get stuff here like the model, which is just the concept, the OO concept of an object. You've got, you know, stuff that does an increment, it does a count +1, and stuff like that. So I won't go into this too much because I know C# way better than I know F#, but I just wanted you to see that there are similarities between them. So if you decide you want to do it in F#, anything that you can do in C# you can do in F# in Xamarin, so that is an option to you. So, and if we just actually do it, we'll run that quickly so you can just see, we'll do it on iOS because it deploys a bit quicker. So just apply that quickly and you'll see that in F# it looks exactly the same. When it compiles down to the platform level to actually put it on the device, you can't tell whether it's F#, C#, Xamarin, written in like Objective-C, Swift, anything like that. It still looks the same. So, yeah, so okay, the color's different because I picked a different color, but exactly the same as before. So yeah, that's cool. And we can stop that. So yeah, as you saw, all the same. So that's cool. So Jim's discovered that he can, you know, make a counter app quite easily in either F# or C#, and he can deploy it to an iOS or Android, whatever. But what about other things you might want to do with it? You know, one of the things that you might well be used to is CI or continuous integration, continuous deployment CD, you know, stuff like that. So one of the options that you can use is VSTS or Visual Studio Team Services. Some of you may well know this XKCD comic. It was a bit of a running joke where I used to work, because if we weren't doing anything, it really was because it was compiling, and it's Jenkins, it takes a while. But what is VSTS? So VSTS is just part of the .NET framework, but not in terms of code, but it's just a tool that you can use to do different things that you might do in your project management and software development lifecycle. So one of the things it offers you is a code repository. So if you don't want to pay for GitHub and you don't have GitLab, whatever, you might use this instead. So it's all end-to-end. So you can have Git-based version control or Visual Studio Team Services version control, whatever it is they call it. Team Foundation version control. You may know better than I do. I always just stick to Git because it's what I know. But yeah, so you've got this code repository. You've also got, obviously, the build and deploy cycle. So as I'll show you shortly, you can send the code up. It will build it and deploy it for you, whether that's end-to-end with any unit test or UI test projects that you've got. So, you know, as you may well be used to, or you may not with CI, it just means that you can make sure that everything runs end-to-end without any problems. It also does some other stuff that I won't show you today, but could be quite useful in an enterprise environment, like load testing, release management, and stuff like App Insights and Hockey App, which you may have heard of before. But as I said, the main things that we'll look at today is the code repository and the continuous integration. So let's have a look at it. Yep, so if you go to visualstudio.com, it will redirect you to this page. The thing you want here is just Visual Studio Team Services, and you can just click Get Started for free. So just click that. Zoom out. Yep, so you might see this as empty the first time you come on here, if it's the first time that you've actually used VSTS, but it comes up with an organization, which is the one it creates by default, and then you get different projects. So what we'll do is we'll create a project for our counter. You know, in the real world, you may or may not do this, but it's just a great way of taking a really easy to get started app, sticking it in VSTS, and experiencing continuous integration. So we'll start with create project. Someone want to pick a witty name for it? All right, okay, we'll just call it counter C#. Fair enough, cool. So we'll just leave it as default, but you can pick what type of version control you want. And work item process, don't worry about that too much. That's just that you can have sort of work item tracking boards, and it'll just control the format that it's in. I'll leave it as agile by default. That's just your traditional Kanban. So we'll click create, and that will put it together. So it'll take a couple of minutes. Well, hopefully not a couple of minutes, but it should just think about it for a minute and create the project. But one of the things we can do while we wait is when you create these projects, it will give you the options you'll see in a minute to download the code or whatever, but obviously being a brand new project, it makes no assumptions about what type of project it is you're making, so it'll give you a blank one. So the easiest thing to do is just push out one that already exists. So we're in the code for the counter that we just made in C#. So what we'll do is we'll just quickly start the project, and then we will add everything. Just check it's added everything. Yep. Don't worry too much about that. I'm sure most of you have seen Git. So if we just check on it now, there we go. So as I said, it gives you the option to clone it to your computer. I tend to avoid it just because, as I said, it makes assumptions about the type of your project, and it will just give you a blank project. So it won't know that it's a Xamarin project. So what we'll do is we will push an existing. This is not good. Not liking what PowerPoint is doing to my cursor. There we go. So yeah, so if you do a push an existing, it'll give you these commands to run. The reason why I did, let's just hang on, let's just zoom into these so you can see it better. Yeah, so you might see these commands here. You'll see them in a minute when I paste them into terminal if it's a bit hard to read. But the reason that I did those commands first is because, as you'll see, all this does is add the remote to push it to, and then, I don't know why it went back, and then actually push it up. But that's not what we want, because it needs to know the files to push up first. So if we just paste that, right, you'll see it's just adding the origin and then doing a push. Right, it's too zoomed in. There we go, that's better. So if we just press enter now, it'll just push it up for us. Ooh. Oh, there we go. See, first mistake already. I forgot to commit something. I can count. There you go. So once we do that, and then doesn't like exclamation marks. So now we can try that again, and it should work. Hey. Oh, there we go. So it's pushed it up now. So if we go back into VSTS, go into the demo, and there you go. So now it looks different because it knows that the code is there. And the first thing you'll see is the option to start continuous integration. So we'll set up a build. It knows that it's a VSTS Git, so obviously it does support all these other options, but it knows that we've pushed up code and it's stored in VSTS Git. So we can just click continue. Lots of options, can be a bit daunting sometimes, but don't worry too much. We can just type Xamarin in the box and it will come up with the options. So it does mean we have to do it twice for both Android and iOS, but it is quick and easy, so it won't take a minute. So if we just click apply, it'll bring up this window. This is just, don't worry too much about this, but this is just the phase it calls it for actually building the project. It's crossed out the ones it knows we don't have, which is to do with test projects, otherwise a build would fail because it wouldn't be able to find the projects. The main thing that we care about with the Android project is just making sure that in triggers, in the triggers tab, I'll just zoom in so you can follow the mouse, enable, so triggers tab and enable continuous integration. That way, when you push it up, it will see that you've pushed the code up and it will run a build every time. So we'll tick that, save and queue. So what we'll do when we click that, if we just zoom out there, click save and queue. So what that means is it saves that build definition for you and then asks it to queue up a build. And that's fine, but building, as you'll see in a minute, takes a few minutes because it does a new get restore, which doesn't matter what .NET framework you're on, it takes ages. So while it's waiting for that, we can set up the one for iOS. So we can go back to build, create a new one. Again, looks the same, but this time we're going to do iOS. Now there is one thing to note with this, slightly different to Android, which is you need to click this and make sure that build for iOS simulator is ticked. Never been able to actually find out exactly why that has to be ticked, but all I know from experience is that it doesn't work without being ticked. So I will try and come back to you with an answer of why that needs to be ticked, but for now, just trust me, it won't work if you don't tick it in my experience. So just make sure it's ticked. It is ticked by default, but always worth checking. Go into triggers, enable CI again, so exactly the same as Android, save and queue, and that'll go off and build. As I said, it does take a minute, so I'll just quickly show you another example of one that I've used before that actually has more in it than just a couple of build definitions. So this one here is something I do actually work on. So if you look at work items, you'll see that I've got a friend of mine to do a code review, and he's just come in and given me a few work items that I can look at. Then in build and release, we'll just very quickly touch on this. You'll see, yeah, this is what it looks like when it goes green. So yeah, that's kind of how you get started, and it said I'll just leave it to build, and then shortly it will go green. If we get time at the end, we'll go back to it, and hopefully it'll all go green, and you can see it's gone green. So let's go back to this. So we've created this counter, and that was nice and easy, and we've pushed it up to VSTS, and that's great. But what about other uses of it? So this is actually a real-world example of someone's release definition list from, actually uses VSTS day to day. Does anyone in here actually recognize any of the definitions on this list? Yeah, a couple of people do. So a friend of mine at Microsoft, he makes a lot of plugins for Xamarin, and obviously you can imagine plugins like with any other .NET plugins end up on NuGet. So this is his list of definitions. So he uses VSTS for building. He pushes the code, it builds it. If it passes everything in release, he builds up the NuGet packages and he pushes up to VSTS. So people do actually use VSTS for real world things. So I'll read this in a second, but it's fine. So you've got a counter, really great app to get started with. It's something like a bit like a calculator. It's a really good getting started sample, and that you can show off to your friends, but maybe you want to do a bit more with it. And this is where I like cognitive services. So this is Microsoft definition. Microsoft Cognitive Services, formerly Project Oxford, are a set of APIs, SDKs, and services available to developers to make their applications more intelligent, engaging, and discoverable. Cool, so that's someone's marketing from their docs, great, and it is true, but what does that actually mean? What can you actually do with it? So let's have a look. So what we'll do is we'll just quickly jump on here, and I will show you, mouse has gone again. Go back to browser, there we go. So if we go back on here. So I'll just go through this quickly. So this is just a list. I apologize for the size. To fit it all in one page, I just had to zoom out quite a lot, but I will just go through a few of these. So these are just different categories of things that you can do. So cognitive services, as the description mentioned, is kind of machine learning and AI. So one example is computer vision. So it's using AI models and machine learning, and it's kind of spent a lot of time using different models to learn what things look like. So one of those examples that Microsoft uses is a guy swimming. By just showing it a guy swimming underwater, it knows enough about that it can pick up features from it and go, that is a man swimming underwater. Other examples I quite like are Bing Web Search. So you can actually just put a search bar into your application, send a request to Bing Web Search, and it will come back and give you a response. Some other ones in here under speech, so that can be stuff like translation or speech to text and anything like that might be helpful. And then other stuff around language and knowledge. I quite like Q&A Maker because it's an example of those kind of equivalent of the Facebook Messenger chat windows that you get where you can ask it a question and it will just come back to you straight away. But what we'll do now is we'll actually go through an example that I've used cognitive services for. So we'll go back to here a second. So a few people in here I do actually work with might know this, and anyone that knows me outside of work. I am quite terrible at reading body language and non-verbal cues. An example of that is I was playing a board game with my work colleagues a few weeks ago, and one of the parts of the game involved attacking each other or trading for stuff. And one of the things that was happening was that a player sat next to me was attacking me on the board, and I was trying to barter for peace by offering him something in exchange for him backing off. Except he was just smirking at me. I thought he was agreeing to it. Turned out, no, he was smirking and he attacked me anyway. So it made me realise that, well, it didn't matter, I knew anyway, but it's just an example of the fact that, I'm not great with body language. So one of the things that I wanted to do was actually make use of cognitive services to make my life easier. Because, we can all make apps to show off to our friends, but actually it's useful as well. So I'll just take you through an example app that I put together that makes my life easier, or at least I hope it does. It has so far. So we'll get it up. There we go. So what I'll do is, We're actually going to deploy this one to a real device because it uses some features that require a real device. So just to save some time deploying, I'm just going to get it started deploying now, but I'll talk you through it while we wait. So put it to my device. So we'll set that going. I'll unlock my phone and then we'll go to it as soon as it deploys. So just get that started. Yeah, so that's deploying. So what this app is, you'll see in a minute, is just two uses of cognitive services that I found. So one is sentiment analysis of text, and the other is actually, similar to the computer vision stuff, but rather than describing it, it's using the face API to recognize faces and then pick out some emotion from it. But we'll see that in a minute. So that should build in a second. So we will just pull my phone up. Oh no, it's decided it doesn't want to connect. There we go. There we go, there's my phone. So in a minute, it should pop up. So apart from me breaking the code apparently by making the text too big, I forgot to do the second button. But for those that can't see at the back, that first button just says analyze text. So that's the sentiment analysis I was telling you about. So if we just click the button and enter some text. So I'll do it from here because it's easier. I am having the best time. So we can ask it to go off and analyze that. As usual, the cursor's vanished, so let's press the button. There we go, it comes back and sings. I meant to change that gold to a different color, I apologize. To anyone at the back that can't see that because it's too bright, it's singing zippity-doo-dah at you because I'm having the best time. But one thing to note about this text analysis is it's good for things like this when it's obviously positive, but it's really rubbish at sarcasm. But most computers are. So am I, actually, but... So that's text analysis, cool. But, as I said, the main one that I mentioned before is taking a photo and analysing the photo. So let's just go back to that. So... does anyone want to be a volunteer to come and pull a silly face? Anyone? No? No? Oh, all right, okay. So, let's pull a silly face. Guess it's down to me. Let's pull a silly face. I don't know. There we go. Pull a silly. It's the only silly face I know. There we go. So what I'll do is I'll click OK on that, and that will send it off to analyze. It can take a minute sometimes based on the internet. So while we wait for it to do that, I will just take you through what's going on. So you'll recognize, oh, cursor's gone again, there we go. You'll recognize the stack layout like we saw before. Again, this is just the main page that you saw, so you just got a button that says analyze the text or analyze the body language. You'll see on the right here it's laid out slightly differently. That's because I'm using the Mvvm architecture. Has anyone in here used Mvvm for anything? Cool, quite a lot of you, yeah. So you know what it's about. So I just split this up to make it easier to deal with because it's a bigger application. So we've got these commands that are bound to these buttons. So all it does is just, as you can imagine, let's just zoom in. There you go, so just zoom in. So it's just nice and simple. When you click one of the buttons, depending on which button you clicked, just navigate to that page. So the first thing we'll look at then is how I did that text analysis. And you'll see that there's some bits that took longer, but in general, the cognitive services side of things is just a few lines of code. So you've got this bit here that just says, it's the stuff that you saw. It's a label, enter some text, an editor. So that's the text box that you could enter some stuff. This auto-size text changes is, as you'd imagine, it's just the fact that the text box, if you start writing more than a few words, the text box will get bigger. It seems quite a minor thing to point out, but it's actually quite new to Xamarin Forms 3. Before, you'd either have to chop words off or hide them because the box is too small, or have a ridiculously large box just in case anybody entered some text. So we've got these buttons, and that actually goes away and does the analysis, and then the label that displays the result that you saw. So in the view model itself, you've got these properties. So the way I've done this, the data binding that you saw when it said binding in the text or command, whatever, is just private backing fields, and then the properties themselves, just getters and setters. This set property stuff you may not have seen before. It's just a plugin that I use for Mvvm architecture that just makes it easier because it goes away and does all the iNotify property change stuff for you. But the main kind of crux of the code is in the analyze text stuff. So you can see a switch statement here that just, we've got this text analyzer and it says analyze it with the text that we grab from that box. And then based on the result, either change the text color or change the text color and the text. And as you can see, there's various options. Can't tell, you seem normal to me, or I added a bit of sarcasm. If it's negative, as the meme goes, it sucks to be you. So how does it actually do that analysis? So let's actually have a look at this text analyzer. So this one uses HTTP and REST, which you may well have seen before. So we will just focus on a bit of it. So the first bit is just building up the HTTP request, using HTTP client, which some of you may have used before. It's just building up the request that you need to send. The important bits here are just adding in the headers, so your subscription key, and then the endpoint that you want to send it to. Again, this is all hidden because no one needs to see my keys. But yeah, so you've just got, it just literally all it does is builds up that request with the text that it wants to show, and then sends that request off, gets a response back, does some error handling, and if everything's okay, it just starts to do some analysis on the score that it gets back. So it sends it off to this endpoint, gets a response back, deserializes it, and then that's all it's really had to do to talk to Cognitive Services, is just build up that request JSON, send it off, and get a response back. Then it's got the score out of that, which is what Cognitive Services gives you, and then it's just decided what you're feeling based on that. So really simple. So let's just have a look. Has it come back with a response for how I'm feeling? Let's have a look. Yes, it has. Oh, mouse has gone again. There we go. So apparently I am 0.562 contempt. So what does that mean? So the way that Cognitive Services does this stuff, you may well know if you've ever done any machine learning or AI stuff before, is it does it as a probability score out of 1. So it's basically saying there's a 0.562 probability that I am contempt, which obviously is just 56.2% really. But I just wanted to leave it in as that score, just so that you get the idea of what you actually get back. So that's fine. So how did I actually do it? Because text analysis is cool, but being able to do stuff like this is even cooler. So let's just have a look. So zoom out a bit. So again, we've got, oh, cursor's gone again. There we go. So this is the page, this is how I put together. So rather than the stack layout that you saw before, this page actually uses grids. So this is, as you can imagine, a grid that you've probably seen from all sorts of other things, rows, columns. Haven't worried about columns in this, it's just a few rows. But we've got the image. So that's, of course, once you've taken the photo, it's the image that showed up, as you saw when it had it in the background. The button to take a photo. And then this grid here at the bottom is just you might have seen it briefly, the spinner that said looking for faces. That's what this grid is. It just overlays it on of that because you don't, it's thinking about it, so it's just its kind of loading screen concept. So that's the kind of the view, but let's have a look at the actual crux of it. So in here, we've got this view model for the analyzed body language. So this actually uses a plugin called Media Plugin, which is just an abstraction for the camera. So rather than having to know how to kind of put the code together for taking photos for every platform, it's all in one place, makes it a lot easier for you. And I really like these plugins. It's really useful for Xamarin having these abstraction plugins that just make it a lot easier to do something for cross-platform. So it starts off by, in the constructor, just setting up that command button that we saw. And then this is the SDK for face. So it creates a client, it passes in the credentials so that it knows that you're allowed to actually make these requests, sets the endpoint, and then this main bit here around the take the photo, which we will just zoom in a bit and follow the cursor. So this stuff here is the plugin for taking the photo. So it's just saying, take the photo and make it into a stream, because that's what we need to send it over the internet. Then with this stream, build up this concept of face operations and attributes. So attributes, as I mentioned before, is we've got this face API, but what things in the face that we find do we care about? So in this case, I've said, just get the values of every type to list. That basically means I'm not going to filter out specifically at the minute, just give me back everything. So all the different attributes it can pick up, like age or emotion, things like that, it will pick up, it will come back with for you. So I've just chosen to use emotion, but it will actually cover everything. So then if it actually finds a face, it goes off and changes pages to this image result page, which I'll go on to in a minute. And then, of course, if it doesn't find a face, it just pops up and says, is anybody there? And if there's any errors, again, it just pops up and gives you that error. Now, one of the things that I've done with this app that I wouldn't recommend is just because it's a sample for me, I've made assumptions that you've always got internet connection. If you're doing something like this yourself or trying the sample, I would recommend just checking that you've got internet connection, but I just made assumption that I'll always be sat at home or out somewhere with signal. I guess it comes under first world problems, assuming you've always got internet connection. But, so as I said, we'll go on to the page and what it looks like. So we've got this result. So you pass in that photo and then the list of faces that it got back when it analysed that photo for you. It goes off and says, get me the emotions, which is just a key value pair I've done at the bottom. So that just says, get the emotion for the face. For every possible emotion type, build up a key value pair of the name of that emotion and then the actual score, which is a double. So how do I use that? Well, at the bottom, I return it, basically say, for all the emotions, just order it highest first, and then send that one back. And that will give you what I've used here as the most likely emotion. So I've just said, get the name of it, and then the score, which is what you saw when it said the most likely is that I've got contempt with a score of 0.562. So yeah, as you saw, a lot of the code is actually just asking it to take a photo and then dealing with when it gets the photo back. But when it comes to actually just getting the image, it's quite simple. It's just building up a few lines and then sending it off, which when you consider what it's doing, I think is really quite cool. So that's cool. So we've seen how Jim or any of you or myself can build up an app, whether that's just a counter app or something more substantial with cognitive services. But, as the picture suggests, the world's your oyster. What other things can be done with it? So there's some really cool examples of stuff that cognitive services and Xamarin have been used to do, far more than I've been able to do. But they're just things I wanted to show you because I think it's just an amazing example of the power of what can be done. So one example here is this chest X-ray. So what this is Microsoft Garage. If any of you don't know, Microsoft Garage is the R&D department of Microsoft. And some interns, while they were doing their internship at Microsoft Garage, actually built this app with Xamarin and Cognitive Services. So as you can guess, it's a chest X-ray analysis. So what it does is you give it a photo of an X-ray of a chest, and it will actually come back and give you the likelihood that it is something. So if I zoom in so you can see at the bottom here, you've got the likelihood that it is one of those conditions. So that's really quite clever when you consider maybe in a developing country, you've got not quite as many medical facilities or as many trained staff to look at these things. So someone with limited medical experience can take an iPad in, have a look at these X-rays, and then very quickly, in theory, come back and tell you what the likelihood is of different conditions. So that can save lives. That's awesome. And it's not just chest X-rays. Another example that I really like is, if we just zoom out again, is one involving skin cancer. So what they did was, I just zoomed this up so you can see. So don't worry about all the text. I'll zoom in a minute. But yeah, so this is using skin cancer prediction with machine learning, Core ML, and Xamarin. So what they did was they put together an app to detect skin cancer. So they started off by doing the usual AI machine learning stuff of training the model. Then they deployed that model and slowly but surely kind of built that up, taught it about different skin cancer signs, so melanoma or skin lesions or unusual looking moles, and then used Xamarin to develop an app that made use of that model and that data, and then could use it to identify skin cancer. So if a doctor's tired or they've got limited skills or availability, they can just take this app and show it some photos of these skin conditions, and it will be much faster tell you whether it's a reason to worry. The chances of it being a form of cancer, which I think is cool, because again, if doctors are tired or they've not got much time, this can save lives. And I just think it's a really cool use of cognitive services along with Xamarin and all the other things it could possibly do. This is just medical, but there's all these things that could be done with agriculture or anything like that. This could really change not just stuff for us, but for developing countries or people with any kind of difficult physical, mental disability, or as I said, health, like you've seen here. So I think that's really awesome. So what's it? So I said that's just a few examples. There's probably many more if you actually looked, did a lot of research into it. I know the examples are kind of cropping up more every day. So what have we learned? So we know what Xamarin is, I hope. Cross-platform mobile development tool in .NET. How to get started. How you can deploy it to Visual Studio Team services for continuous integration. You saw examples in F# and C#, and how there's a lot of similarities between them, which means that you can kind of start to make use of some of the pros of functional programming in your code. And then discovered using cloud computing on Azure, depending on where you're from, with cognitive services to do some really cool things. So this is just a few useful links of things that you might want to visit. I'll leave this up for a few minutes. I recommend that if anyone wants to take a photo of this, they do, because this is kind of a corroboration? I can't think of the word. Amalgamation of useful links. So the top one is the Xamarin documentation. So this is now on the Microsoft Docs, which means it's all open source. So if you don't like, if there's a spelling mistake or you think something could be worded better, all open source, you're free to make changes to it, like with any Microsoft documentation. Then university.xamarin.com. So one of the cool things that Xamarin did long before the Microsoft acquisition that is still around today is Dameron University. So it's, as you can imagine, it's a complete online university. So there's live classes with real teachers around the world. There's guest lectures, lightning talks, video content. And if you sign up, you get a free 30-day trial, which has complete access to everything. But even if you don't want to pay for the license, just the offline content itself can be really helpful, because there's even self-guided learning. So if you want to build a project and learn about something in your own time, that is an option. So this link here is kind of how to get started with cognitive services. So it will take you to a site where it will show you some of the different things that you can do, a bit like that list I showed you before. And you'll be able to get started. There's some examples, there's documentation, there's tutorials. So it's a really good resource. Portal.azure.com you may have used. So as you can imagine, this cognitive services stuff starts from in the Azure portal. In a minute, I will take you through the portal and just quickly show you how you can get started with it, as well as anything else you might want to see. Then these two at the bottom are a couple of good books. So if you are happy with docs, but you also just like a good textbook to read, this one's good for Xamarin Forms. So this link will take you to a free EPUB or PDF version of a book called Creating Mobile Apps with Xamarin Forms by Charles Petzold, which is a really good reference to get started. I've actually got a physical copy, and I think the book's about that thick. So there is quite a lot of content in it. And then another good one at the bottom is, if you want to learn about the traditional non-Xamarin Forms way, then this book, Xamarin in Action, which is what this link will take you to, is a really good one for that. And to put him on the spot, the guy that wrote it is in the front row. But genuinely, ignoring that it's on the front row, it is actually a really good book. I went through it. I made my first app from start to finish. I'm an absolute fan person when it comes to Xamarin Forms, because I like the fact that it's just one code across all platforms. So I'd never really given traditional Xamarin that much time. And then following this book, I did actually make an app natively and didn't have a horrendous time.
Thank you very much.